So another improvised patch tutorial. Also today we will try to build a patch from scratch together. Today we will concentrate on the VCV sequential switches. There is a lot to explore. I hope I can go through everything. If not, you will have homework, which is always fun. But basically, sequential switch will switch between inputs and outputs sequentially, and we can choose the inputs and we can choose the outputs. So basically, it's another type of sequencer. And in software, in VCV Rack, in other software, you will usually find two distinct modules, one with multiple inputs and one output, and one with one input and multiple outputs. This is because of how software works, the limitation of software. But in hardware, in eurorack, for example, usually you will find both functionalities in one module depending on how you patch things. But in VCV Rack, we have two distinct modules, which might make it easier a bit to see visually what's going on. So the first thing we can try is, for example, switch between waveforms and create something a bit more complex. Right, so if we look, for example, at the VCV VCO, right, we have multiple waves that we can, for example, switch between. So again, I will use the 4-to-1, so we have 4 inputs, and they will be sequentially switched into one or through one output, right? So if I use the sine, the triangle, the saw, and the square, already at the end here, let me put this up for a second, I will add also a filter, just so it's not too much, it's too loud and too much in destroying our hearing. Right, so now we have the 4 inputs, and we need to tell the sequential switch when to switch between these inputs, right? And this we can do with any trigger source, with any clock module, or even with an LFO, for example. If I send this to the trigger input, right, we get a sequence that waves are switching between one another. Right, now you might notice that we get some clicks in the sound because the switching doesn't necessarily happen when it's silent. But in the right-click menu of both switches, we can activate the declick. Right, again without and with. Right, this will add a sort of a fade in, fade out between the waveforms, so we can get rid of clicks. Right, so this is all nice and all, but let's start building something interesting here. Maybe something a bit more rhythmic, for example, again with the sec3. Right, maybe we'll have, let's stay with 8 steps, why not? And the trigger output will go and will trigger the sequential switch. I can also connect the reset already, just in case I want to reset things. Right, and let's go with something a bit quicker. And let's have a rhythm here. Right, maybe something like this. Right, now we can make this even more interesting because we have here 4 inputs, we have 4 waveforms or 4 channels. And, sorry, and for now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. But if I have 5 steps, for example, we have this cycle that sounds a bit longer than it really is. Right, we get a bit more of an interesting movement. Right, and of course we can also sequence things. So what I can do, if I take the filter for a second down here, already I will use the Venom mixer as I've used before in the previous videos, which should be VCA, this one here. Right, just so we have also a stereo mixer if we need it. And already what we can do is we can use, for example, another VCO, right? Another oscillator. And even better yet, maybe even a different type of VCO. So I will use, for example, let's say the FM2 VCO from Surge XT. I really want to start also in these videos exploring the Surge XT collection. Let me know what you think about this, or if you want to stay mostly with VCV, because there are so many interesting modules from Surge XT that can be really quite interesting. So let's say the FM2 VCO, and let's go with the wavetable VCO and the VCV VCO. Right, so what we will do, we have 3 rows here, so what we can do, we can add a quantizer, right, for each of the rows. We can choose different notes. So here, for example, let's not have the F, here not have the B flat, and here not have the C, for example. Right, just to have some variation. Then we have the 3 rows, 1, 2, and 3. And this will go to the 3 oscillators that we have here. Right, and now let's say let's start with the saw wave, and then the FM2, and then maybe the square wave, and then the wavetable oscillator. Right, and soon we will add also some modulation here. Right, and again, of course, we want also to sequence things. So I will just change the... Right, we get a much longer sequence from the 3 oscillators. Of course, we can change things here. I will not dive too deeply into the FM2 and the wavetable. Again, let me know if you're interested, if I should explore also more these oscillators. So basically you change here the FM amount and you get beautiful sounds. Here we can choose maybe a different wavetable, and then morph here between them. So what I will do, I will add a module, it's called the Mod 7 from Sequocel, which are basically 7 LFOs. And wait a minute, before we do any of this, I cannot listen to this without effects. I'm really, really sorry. So what we will do, we will add a delay that will be synced. I'm sorry, but it's not going to work. That will be synced to the clock. And also, of course, a reverb. Let's go with Galaxy, just because it's not such a big module. Right, so we have delay and we have reverb. And now we can go back. Right, and do something. Change the delay time. Add some reverb. Right, maybe take the mix of the delay bit down. Right, so again, we have the Mod 7 from Sequocel, and this is basically 7 LFOs, and with each LFO I can change the rate. So for example, I can modulate here the FM amount on the FM2 VCO. We have here a modulation matrix. All I have to do is click the button that I want to send the modulation from, and then set the amount of modulation, right? So already we have here movement, and I can change the rate of the LFO, right, to make it a bit slower. And then here, for example, I can map the morph between the wavetable. Right here we have a square wave. I can control the pulse width. Right, I can also make, for example, one oscillator lower. Maybe the FM2 can be an octave down. Right, and then another LFO to control the filter. Right, so already we have lots of movement, again, switching between the different oscillators, between the different waves, creating something a bit more complex, which is quite nice. Right, so this is already something interesting you can try with a sequential switch. Now another thing we can do, and this maybe also we will do with this voice, is routing one voice to different effects, and again switching between the effects. Right, so for example, if I disconnect here this delay, let's say that the reverb will be the last in the chain, and now we need to mix things into the reverb. So I will use another module from Surge XT, the mixer. Right, which is a stereo mixer. So again, we will have the delay on one channel, right, and this will go to Galaxy, so we're going to mix in a few different effects. Right, so let's say a delay here, and then let's say maybe plateau, What am I doing here? I got a new keyboard and I'm still getting used to it. Maybe plateau, the reverb will be the second effect. Right, so we can switch between two different effects. And let's do something like this. I will use, in this case, the 1 to 4 sequential switch. In this case, we have one input and then multiple outputs, right? And we can select how many outputs we want to use. In this case, let's just use two effects. I'm going to use two channels. I just changed the steps here to 2. Again, in the right-click menu, I'm going to activate the D-click, just so we don't get weird clicks. And then the voice from the filter will go to the switch. One output will go to the delay. Another output will go to the reverb. And we will change the reverb here to be something a bit more creative, because we have already a reverb at the end, right? To be something a bit more interesting. And then to switch, what we can do to switch, let's use the, let's mix a few triggers from the sequencer. So since we have here individual outputs, individual gate outputs or trigger outputs that we can use. Now they will not happen really at the same time. Each of them will happen at its own step, right? So we can mix them with a regular mixer, which will be more or less like combining them rather than mixing them. Right, so I can just use the mix module here from VCV, and let's say that step 1, let's say step 3, and another step, let's say step, which one is it, 6. Right, again, we have on the switch 2 channels, but I have 3 steps, so it will be a bit more interesting, a bit more of a longer sequence. And then this I can use to switch, right, between the outputs. In this case, we have one input and multiple outputs to switch between the delay and the reverb that now we will change also. So the reverb is input 2 on the mixer, right? I will take the dry all the way down. Again, I want something a bit more creative. Add wet. Now with plateau, we can do so many things. I can disable the diffusion and take it all the way down, so we get something a bit more like a delay, right, with more decay. Right, so something a bit different, right? You can also take the decay down, so we can really hear when it's switching. Right? Change the size. Another fun thing here on plateau is that we have the clear button, so we can clear the buffer also of the reverb, basically disconnecting the input, right, and create something a bit more glitchy. So I can use, let's say, the first output with each cycle. We will clear the reverb. Right, so this is just one, but we have also the second one with the delay. Right, so now just a few of the steps will go through the delay, a few of them will go through the reverb. And you know what we can do? Let's have 4 steps actually. Instead of 2, we will have 4 steps, and we will get twice just the dry signal. So the delay, I will take the mix all the way up, because we will get a dry signal on step 2 and on step 4. Right, and this will go to the, again to the mixer, and I have also to mix it before the mixer. Right, so I mix it once and I mix the second one, right? So we have it in one stream, and again set this to 4 steps. Right, and this will be channel 3 on the mixer. Right, so now we have the dry signal, we have the signal after the delay, and we have the signal after the reverb, switching between the waveforms, switching between the effects. This is a much more interesting and unique sequence. Right, maybe I can put Opalach, I can put the reverb here up. Right, so again, we can switch between waveforms, switch between oscillators, switch between different effects, effect chains. You can build whole effect chains and switch between them with a sequential switch. Again, choose the trigger source. It's nice also that it says here trigger and not clock, because it helps you understand that a clock signal doesn't really have to come from a dedicated clock module. It can be any trigger, it can be a sequencer, it can be an LFO. Right, you can really experiment. Like we did here, I'm using different triggers to trigger the sequential switches, so we get a more interesting rhythm. Now another thing we can do, we can chain and route modulation. This, maybe I will leave this for you as homework, because I want to show you how to add randomness to a sequence, because this is also quite fun with a switch. So let me mute this first channel and let's have another voice, another sequence. So let's, for example, use the ADDR sequencer, which is a very simple 8-step sequence. By default, it has 8 steps. Right, if I clock it together with the same clock I have here from the Sec3, and of course we can also reset things. Right, again, we have just 8 steps, so this will be quite repetitive. If I use, for example, let's start just with a VCO, going through a VCA and an envelope, just something very simple, a triangle wave, just so we can hear how this will work. This will be channel 2 here, and maybe I will add some effects soon, let's see. For now, I will use the gates, maybe also from the clock, right? So we get basically a gate for each step. Right, maybe something a bit more percussive. Right, in the right-click menu of the ADDR sequencer, I can change the range. So if I want to use this for pitch, for example, I can use 0 to 1, which will give you 1 octave, 0 to 2 will give me 2 octaves. Let's go with 0 to 1 for now, and I would like to stay also in a certain scale, so I will use the quantizer. This will go to the quantizer and then to the volt per octave, and I can start changing the notes. Let's go here with 0. Right, so we have a repetitive 8-step sequence. Right, very repetitive and not so interesting. But now with the switch, and again, before I'm adding the switch, I'm just going to add maybe another galaxy here, just to have some reverb on this, because I cannot live without reverb. Let's see. Maybe a bit brighter. Right, and it's a bit, again, still a bit lower here in volume. Right, maybe something like this. Right, so again we have a very simple sequence, but what we can do now is use a switch to switch between this repetitive sequence and a random sequence, and add randomness, right, in specific places, specific steps. Right, so what I will do, I will send this sequence to the 4-to-1 sequential switch. So again, we will switch between various or multiple inputs. So we need multiple inputs, one output. This will go back to the quantizer, right? So now we have the same result basically. But now what I can do, if you remember, we used less time process, right? Which has a sample and hold functionality. We spoke about this last time. Sample and hold has nothing to do with randomness by default. It all depends on the signal you're feeding into it. So if you feed a random signal into it, you will get also randomness. But you know what we will do? Instead of random signal, I'm just going to use, which for us will still stay random, I'm just going to use, for example, the oscillator, the FM2 VCO as the signal to sample. Again, it's not noise, it's not random, but it will take a while until it repeats for us. Basically, we will perceive this as random. Right, and now we need to tell the sample and hold when to sample this VCO, so I'm going just to use the same clock. Again, we spoke about this last time. And now we have here a random sequence, right? If I use the push module from VCV, I just have a button here. If I just switch to the to this signal, right, it's nice, but it's basically all over the place. So what we can do, we can attenuate this a bit. I hope I'm not going too fast. We can attenuate this to a certain range, and you know what, instead of the VCA, let's use the rescale, right? Rescale is perfect for rescaling voltages, right? We did this also in one of the videos. So now I can attenuate it and push it. I want this to be a bit higher. Right, so now we have more or less a random sequence, and again I can switch. If I change this to 2 steps, I can switch between this randomness and the original sequence. Now I don't want this to be one time original, one time random. I want the randomness to come in more or less, just adding sparkles here and there. So what I can do, I can use the original sequence 3 times, and then the randomness 1 time, set this again to 4 channels, the push now we don't need, set this to 4 channels, and then let's use, for example, again, we can mix 2 gate outputs from the sequencer. Right, let's go, for example, let's go with, what is this, 5 and 8. Right, again, just combining them basically, and this will trigger the 4 to 1. Right, and now we have a bit more variation. Now again, because we have 4 inputs, and in this case we have 2 gates, we will get something a bit, in my opinion, in this case, it's a bit too repetitive. So let's mix in another gate, maybe also the first step. Right, we can have even another one. Let's have, what are we not using? This one? Right, and maybe even another one. You know, instead of mixing them, I can just use, because we have 5, I can just use the same trigger output. Ah, this is much better. Right, so we have repetitiveness, but then some sparkle there with the random sequence. I hope you understood why I'm not using the mix, right? I have here already 4. If I mix in another one, basically I'm using the same sequence like from the trigger output here, so I don't need the mixer. Right, so again, we have a repetitive sequence, but now it's with some sparkle, with a few random notes here and there. I can even make them higher, right, just for fun. Right, and again, I'm going to send this to a delay, because we can. Again, let's sync this. Maybe I will sync it just with the first output here, so it will be a bit slower. Right, and I can take the depth. If I take the mix all the way up, not the depth, the built-in EQ, I can take it more up, so it will grab more or less these higher notes. Right, so it's grabbing more the higher notes than the lower ones. So first of all, it's not so muddy, but also we get the variation more with an echo. Right? We can use another LFO here to modulate the decay. Maybe make it slower, or maybe even quicker actually. Right, just so we have some variation. Let's listen to this with the first voice, maybe I will mix them in. Right, with the weird effects, this was quite nice. Right, it's quite a nice sound. Right, and again we have some randomness. We have some stability. Right, so this was adding randomness to a sequence again with the sequential switch. I want to show you another, we will create now a nice bass drone, and I love this technique for a nice bass drone, basically wave splicing, which is very interesting. It works a bit differently with this switch than with other switches, and most commonly you will use a crossfader for this technique, but it works also really nicely with a switch. So again, let's see for a second what will happen here. Let me mute this. Okay, and now I like to use 3 different oscillators for this technique. 1, 2, and 3. What we will do, we will use again a switch, the 4 to 1, right? We will switch between multiple inputs. And what we will do, let me take one VCO here to the right. You will see also in a second why, and I will use also a scope. So what we will do, we will switch between 2 different waveforms. With this switch, you can do it also with 3 or 4, but I find 2, it works the best. Right, so again, we need 2 channels, right? We will switch between 2 different waveforms at audio rates. And by that, we will create a much, much more complex waveform. So this will go to the output, right? Let me already connect this also to another channel here. Right, so we have basically, for now, just the triangle wave, right? I'm using 2 triangle waves. Maybe I can use 1 triangle, 1 sine. If I take the VCO for a second all the way down, and again, I'm going to activate the declick just so it's not so harsh. Right, I'm taking this all the way down, and I'm going to use the square wave to switch or to trigger the sequential switch, right? Already we get basically a sine and a triangle wave switching. But now the fun starts when we start triggering this at audio rates. We get something a bit more interesting, right? You see we have 1 triangle and 1 sine, but now we can have even more fun by detuning the oscillators and tuning them to different intervals. So for example, the first oscillator here I will take all the way to C2, right? Again, by default, most VCOs in VCV Rack could be tuned to the note C4. If you right-click the frequency, you can enter different notes. So I entered C2, right, and then it will be tuned to C2. Let's have this one, for example, at C3. And then I hold Control and Shift, and I can start detuning them. Right, and already we get movement. And then also the oscillator that we are using to switch, we can detune. Up a bit. Right, and of course we can switch between different waveforms. Before I do this, I'm going to use another filter. Let's do this. I'm going to use one of my favorite chorus effects in VCV Rack. This is the electric ensemble from Flag. And then we will get a stereo signal that we can then filter with the Surge XT delay filter, right? So we're going to have this, I need this one here. I'm going to have chorus and then a filter, a stereo filter. And now I'm going to switch, instead of triangle and sine, let's go triangle and saw. Right, and again I'm going to tune here. Listen to this movement. Right, again, wave splicing, you can see what happens here to the wave. We switch between sine and so in this case. Right, now with other switches and with crossfaders, the pulse width of the square wave would also have an effect on the sound. Here it's not, but you can also try with this, and with the crossfader it's a bit more subtle of an effect because you can crossfade. It will not switch directly, it will crossfade between them, so you can experiment with this. For now I'm going to add chorus to this. Right, cut the lows a bit, add more drive, add more resonance, add more drive. Let's see what happens when I go, instead of C2, I'm going to tune this to C1. Oh, it's even nicer. Right, a little bit more bassy. Right, so we have a nice drone. Again, with wave splicing with a sequential switch. Also here I'm going to add reverb. In this case it's going to be plateau. Oh yeah. Right, and we have another LFO here that I can use to modulate the filter. Again, I just connect it, and then with the button I can select where I want, I can map where I want to modulate or what I want to modulate, in this case the frequency of the LFO a bit, and slower. Right, and I will bring in the other voices. Right, so there are so many things that you can explore. There are also other switches, of course. So for example, there are the switches from Count Modular. You have 1 to 8, you have 1 to 16 or 16 to 1 and 8 to 1. You have also different directions here, so it's not just forward, you have forward, backward, pendulum, and even random, so you can also switch between waveforms, for example, randomly. These are also quite interesting switches, sequential switches from ML, again with 8 channels. Again, also here you have randomness. Other switches that can be quite interesting, of course there is the octal router from VCV, but this is but still it's a commercial module. Let me know if you want also a video about it. I think I have an older video about it, maybe a new one is better. It's quite an interesting module. Other switches, there are all sorts of switches available with different features. What I wanted to show you is also hardware modules. So we have, for example, Max Slicer, which is a switch, and we have the Instruotain or Time, which is a switch. And again, in hardware, both of them work. You can see it says here even input-output, right? And also here input-output, because depends on how you patch them. They can be multiple inputs, one output, multiple outputs, one input. In VCV Rack, you cannot have one module doing both. So here in the Instruo one, the upper section is 2 inputs, 1 output. The lower section is 1 input, 2 outputs. Right, and in the case of the Max Slicer, you can do this in the right-click menu. Right, you can change the functionality. But again, in hardware, usually the switches you will find are bi-directional. So it depends on how you patch them, that's the functionality you will get. And again, you will have homework. Try and experiment with chaining and routing modulation with sequential switches. It could be LFOs. You can switch between LFOs, sample and holds, or random voltages, sequences, and so on. Or you can also use the 1 to 4, for example, to switch one modulation to different destinations, filters, effects, and so on and so forth. So please go experiment with this, share your results with us, of course. But this was it for today. Again, let me know what you think about the Surge XT collection if you want me also to explore this a bit. Thank you again so much for watching. Cheers!